Gather close, and listen to stories that will haunt your dreams and make you question the reality around you. From unexplained encounters and ancient legends to the darkest corners of the human mind. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm currently sitting on my front porch, too creeped out to go back inside. There's someone, or something, in my house. 2 months ago, I moved into a new place after a rough patch due to COVID. I won't bore you with the details of that struggle. But tonight, something happened that has left me utterly terrified, and I need to share it. Here's what went down. I was in bed, just scrolling through Reddit, when out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement in my walk-in closet. In a split second, as I turned to look, I saw a human-shaped shadow standing inside, staring directly at me. Panic took over. I leaped out of bed, slammed the bedroom door shut, grabbed a kitchen knife, and started yelling threats about calling the police and that I was armed. Despite my shouts, there was no response, no sound of someone moving or leaving. After a minute, with my heart pounding out of my chest, I realized I'd left my phone in the bedroom. Needing to call for help, I cautiously peeked back into the room. The closet was empty. Absolutely nothing. No sign of anyone or any way someone could have hidden or escaped. I was furious and terrified at the same time. I saw it clearly, its shape, its arms, a distinct humanoid figure. I don't know what to think. Am I losing my mind? I feel like I'm not, but how can I be sure after something like this? This is going to be a lengthy read, and I want to preface it by saying you're welcome to doubt what I share here. After carrying this experience for over 24 years, rarely discussing it since my childhood and never in such a public space, skepticism is something I understand and expect. I'm sharing this not for intrigue but for a personal release, to unburden myself. Even if this gets lost in the sea of internet posts, at least I've expressed it. I'm not originally from this reality, or dimension, or whatever the right word is. This isn't where I started out. Every year around my birthday, which coincides with the start of school when I turned 5, I remember this. My world shifted completely when I was just over 6 years old. I was staying at my grandparents' small farm in Riverside, California, while my mom was in LA and my dad was working nights. One day, determined to find a rattlesnake my grandpa warned me about, I discovered it in the well house. Excited, I ran back to the house to tell my grandparents, but when I got inside, everything had changed. The furniture, the interior decor, even the photos on the walls were all different, replaced by unfamiliar faces and settings. Rushing outside in confusion, I found more things amiss. The chicken coop and pig pen were gone. Panicking and tearful, I ran to our neighbor's house across the road, only to find strangers living in a differently colored house. They called the police, who couldn't make sense of my insistence that I lived with my parents in San Diego and attended Shawnee Elementary. The police and later child services got involved, trying to trace any family connections using the information I provided, like my home address and school, but none of it matched any records. They couldn't find any trace of my parents, my school, or even the apartment complex I claimed to live in. Everything led to dead ends. I was put into the foster system, with police continuing their search by reaching out to the public for any leads. I lived with various foster families and was eventually put up for adoption when no one came forward to claim me. Throughout it all, I held on to a stuffed dog given to me by a kind detective during my initial questioning, a small comfort amid the upheaval. I was never adopted and aged out of the system at 18, struggling with delinquency in my teens. My life was a series of challenges, and it wasn't until my mid-20s that I began to find some direction. Reflecting on these events as an adult, the psychologists I've seen have suggested that I might have invented or distorted these memories as a coping mechanism for trauma, but none of their explanations feel right to me. The reality of my early memories before everything changed remains vivid and undeniable. So here I am, sharing this story not looking for answers anymore, but just to let go of the weight it's been on my mind and heart. If this story resonates with anyone or sparks recognition, feel free to reach out. Maybe together, we can make sense of these inexplicable experiences. This is going to be a lengthy read, and I want to preface it by saying you're welcome to doubt what I share here. After carrying this experience for over 24 years, rarely discussing it since my childhood and never in such a public space, skepticism is something I understand and expect. I'm sharing this not for intrigue but for a personal release, to unburden myself. Even if this gets lost in the sea of internet posts, at least I've expressed it. I'm not originally from this reality, or dimension, or whatever the right word is. This isn't where I started out. Every year around my birthday, which coincides with the start of school when I turned 5, I remember this. My world shifted completely when I was just over 6 years old. I was staying at my grandparents' small farm in Riverside, California, while my mom was in LA and my dad was working nights. One day, determined to find a rattlesnake my grandpa warned me about, I discovered it in the well house. Excited, I ran back to the house to tell my grandparents, but when I got inside, everything had changed. The furniture, the interior decor, even the photos on the walls were all different, replaced by unfamiliar faces and settings. Rushing outside in confusion, I found more things amiss. The chicken coop and pig pen were gone. Panicking and tearful, I ran to our neighbor's house across the road, only to find strangers living in a differently colored house. They called the police, who couldn't make sense of my insistence that I lived with my parents in San Diego and attended Shawnee Elementary. The police and later child services got involved, trying to trace any family connections using the information I provided, like my home address and school, but none of it matched any records. They couldn't find any trace of my parents, my school, or even the apartment complex I claimed to live in. Everything led to dead ends. I was put into the foster system, with police continuing their search by reaching out to the public for any leads. I lived with various foster families and was eventually put up for adoption when no one came forward to claim me. Throughout it all, I held on to a stuffed dog given to me by a kind detective during my initial questioning, a small comfort amid the upheaval. I was never adopted and aged out of the system at 18, struggling with delinquency in my teens. My life was a series of challenges, and it wasn't until my mid-20s that I began to find some direction. Reflecting on these events as an adult, the psychologists I've seen have suggested that I might have invented or distorted these memories as a coping mechanism for trauma, but none of their explanations feel right to me. The reality of my early memories before everything changed remains vivid and undeniable. So here I am, sharing this story not looking for answers anymore, but just to let go of the weight it's been on my mind and heart. If this story resonates with anyone or sparks recognition, feel free to reach out. Maybe together, we can make sense of these inexplicable experiences. This is going to be a lengthy read, and I want to preface it by saying you're welcome to doubt what I share here. After carrying this experience for over 24 years, rarely discussing it since my childhood and never in such a public space, skepticism is something I understand and expect. I'm sharing this not for intrigue but for a personal release, to unburden myself. Even if this gets lost in the sea of internet posts, at least I've expressed it. I'm not originally from this reality, or dimension, or whatever the right word is. This isn't where I started out. Every year around my birthday, which coincides with the start of school when I turned 5, I remember this. My world shifted completely when I was just over 6 years old. I was staying at my grandparents' small farm in Riverside, California, while my mom was in LA and my dad was working nights. One day, determined to find a rattlesnake my grandpa warned me about, I discovered it in the well house. Excited, I ran back to the house to tell my grandparents, but when I got inside, everything had changed. The furniture, the interior decor, even the photos on the walls were all different, replaced by unfamiliar faces and settings. Rushing outside in confusion, I found more things amiss. The chicken coop and pig pen were gone. Panicking and tearful, I ran to our neighbor's house across the road, only to find strangers living in a differently colored house. They called the police, who couldn't make sense of my insistence that I lived with my parents in San Diego and attended Shawnee Elementary. The police and later child services got involved, trying to trace any family connections using the information I provided, like my home address and school, but none of it matched any records. They couldn't find any trace of my parents, my school, or even the apartment complex I claimed to live in. Everything led to dead ends. I was put into the foster system, with police continuing their search by reaching out to the public for any leads. I lived with various foster families and was eventually put up for adoption when no one came forward to claim me. Throughout it all, I held on to a stuffed dog given to me by a kind detective during my initial questioning, a small comfort amid the upheaval. I was never adopted and aged out of the system at 18, struggling with delinquency in my teens. My life was a series of challenges, and it wasn't until my mid-20s that I began to find some direction. Reflecting on these events as an adult, the psychologists I've seen have suggested that I might have invented or distorted these memories as a coping mechanism for trauma, but none of their explanations feel right to me. The reality of my early memories before everything changed remains vivid and undeniable. So here I am, sharing this story, not looking for answers anymore, but just to let go of the weight it's been on my mind and heart. If this story resonates with anyone or sparks recognition, feel free to reach out. Maybe together, we can make sense of these inexplicable experiences. This story, often retold by my mom, never fails to send chills down my spine, making me feel as if someone is constantly watching. When my mom was 14, she lived in a small town in Zacatecas, Mexico, where the bathroom was inconveniently located outside. She would often wake her mother to accompany her during late-night trips to the restroom. One night, around 3 a.m., she woke up needing to use the bathroom. She called for her mother, but there was no response. Growing anxious, she looked toward the foot of her bed and froze. Standing there was what appeared to be her mother in a white robe, arms extended towards her, with an unnaturally somber expression. But then, she noticed something chilling. The figure's feet were hovering above the floor. Realizing this wasn't her mother, she screamed and hid under her covers. Moments later, her actual mother, dressed differently, rushed into the room to find her trembling with fear. The family initially dismissed the encounter as a nightmare, until a few days later, during a power outage. While the family gathered in the living room for comfort, the unmistakable cries of La Llorona echoed down their street at 3 a.m. That night, no one could sleep, shaken by the eerie possibility that my mom's encounter was more than just a dream. When I was just 8 years old, my life was shattered in an instant. My mother and aunt were brutally murdered in our home, and in the midst of the chaos, I did the only thing I could think of. I hid my 4-year-old brother in a closet to keep him safe. After that horrific day, we were separated. I went to live with my grandmother, who eventually adopted me, while my brother was placed with another aunt due to state regulations that required him to be with a blood relative. Life after the tragedy was a blur of grief and confusion. I clung to anything that felt familiar, and my grandmother did her best to provide some semblance of normalcy. But there was one thing I did that she couldn't quite understand. She often found me talking to someone in the closet. One day, she gently asked who I was speaking to. Without hesitation, I told her, "Mommy." To her credit, she didn't press the issue. She just accepted it, perhaps thinking it was my way of coping with the loss. About a month later, my grandmother was dropping me off at my aunt's house so I could spend some time with my brother. As she was about to leave, my aunt pulled her aside, looking concerned. She mentioned something strange that had been happening. Weeks earlier, she had caught my brother sitting in his closet, talking to our mom. The eerie part was that we hadn't had any contact with each other during that time. There was no way we could have coordinated such a thing, especially given that I was only 8 and he was just 4. My grandmother was deeply shaken by this revelation. She believed it was our mother's way of checking on us, making sure we were okay, and saying her final goodbyes. I don't remember these conversations with my mother very clearly, but my grandmother swears that they happened. As the years went by, my brother and I drifted apart. We lost touch completely, and now, I don't even know where he is or how he's doing. Our lives took very different paths after that tragic day, and the connection we once had feels like a distant memory. But sometimes, late at night, I think back to those closet conversations and wonder if my mother really was there with us, even if just for a little while. Maybe she was trying to give us some comfort in the only way she could. My brothers and I were 8, 7, and 4 when it happened. The youngest, being only 4 at the time, has no recollection of that day. But I remember it clearly, and so does my brother who was 7. We scared our nan, pop, parents, and uncles more than I've ever seen them scared before or since. The strange part? My brother and I swear we weren't gone for more than an hour. We even remember our nan looking straight at us and waving, but she swore until her dying day that she never saw us that day. Let me give you some background. For times a year, our family would gather at a cabin we owned, which we called the castle. The castle sat near Wyangala Dam in NSW, Australia. We had a strict rule: we weren't allowed to go past the valley at the bottom of the castle or past the hills on either side. But on this particular day, we broke those rules. It was 2004, and on this trip, our nan and pop, mum and dad, and 2 uncles were with us. At 5 a.m., my brothers and I were already up, dressed, and playing a game called Bob the Builder Cones and Ladders. Our nan, annoyed by us waking her so early, told us to go play but to be back by 7:30 for breakfast. Being the eldest, it was my job to make sure we followed the rules, but that day, I decided it would be cool to go beyond the valley and climb the hill on the other side to watch the sunrise over the dam. I thought we could easily make it back in time for breakfast, and since we'd stay on the road, we'd be visible from the castle if anyone looked for us. So off we went. We reached the top of the hill just in time to see the sun start to rise. Everything was perfect. We stayed there for about 10 minutes, and according to my watch, it was 6 a.m. We started back down, stopping at the valley to take a look. We could see the bottom clearly and, like most kids, decided to explore it. We thought we had plenty of time. As we zigzagged down the valley, avoiding thorn bushes, loose rocks, and painful spinifex grass, we finally made it to the bottom. I checked the time again, 6:15 a.m. That's when we saw her, Nan, standing at the edge of the valley, waving down at us. We figured we were in trouble, but she just smiled and walked away. Thinking we were off the hook, we started back up the other side, laughing and talking as we went. When we emerged onto the road, Nan came running out from the castle, screaming our names. She was frantic, demanding to know where we had been. I was too scared to speak, so I just pointed back at the valley. Nan pulled us into a hug, crying and telling us to get in the car so we could find our pop, parents, and uncles. They were all out searching for us. It wasn't until we were in the car that I noticed the time on the dashboard, 7 p.m. The sun wasn't rising, it was setting. My watch showed the same time. I remember showing it to my 7-year-old brother, and he was just as confused as I was. Last February, our nan passed away unexpectedly. At her funeral, my dad brought up the day we disappeared, even joking that if it had been him and my uncle, Nan wouldn't have cared, but because it was us, her precious grandkids, she was terrified. My youngest brother didn't know what we were talking about, but my other brother and I remember. We told Dad our side of the story, how we'd seen Nan in the valley, how it couldn't have been more than an hour. He then told us that no one, not even Nan, had seen us that day. Nan had stayed at the castle, too afraid to leave in case we came back and no one was there. Dad said Mum had gotten up around 6:30, realized we were too quiet, and started searching. She checked the entire cabin and even our hideout, calling for us with no answer. By then, she woke everyone up. They looked in the valley and never saw us. Since then, my brothers and even Dad have gone back to investigate the valley. None of them can figure out how we could have been hidden from sight. Even if we somehow were, we would have been heard. My youngest brother said he can hear us clear as day when we're in the valley. And there's no way it should have taken us all day to walk back up the other side, it only takes 30 minutes at most. And then there's the biggest mystery of all, who did we see in the valley if it wasn't Nan? Because it sure looked like her. This event took place over 2 decades ago, yet it remains vividly etched in my memory. Shortly after my child was born prematurely at 32 weeks, we were fortunate enough to bring him home within a month, despite his need for continuous oxygen and caffeine treatment due to bradycardia. Once we settled back at home, peculiar occurrences began. Our cat, which had previously shown no interest in the nursery, suddenly refused to enter it at all. Our dog would sit at the foot of the stairs, cocking his head as if hearing something indiscernible. While attending to my child, I would often start speaking aloud, mistaking the presence of my partner entering the room, only to realize I was speaking to an empty space. An animated toy gifted by a friend, designed to say, "peek-a-boo," when activated, would frequently go off by itself, even when securely stored away in a closet. There was an unmistakable feeling of never being alone in that house. My parents had gifted us a sophisticated baby monitor that included a sensor pad placed under the mattress, designed to alarm if no movement was detected over a period. Due to my child's slight frame, weighing just 5 pounds upon arrival home, the alarm would sound frequently. Each time, I would rush to his room to find him perfectly fine, attributing the alarm to his small size rather than sensing any other anomaly. During this period, I frequently dreamed of a woman with long hair hovering by his crib. Though I never saw her face and only perceived her as a shadowy figure, the dreams were strangely comforting rather than frightening. The most startling incident occurred one night when I was abruptly awoken by a vigorous shaking from the side of the bed closest to the door. Startled, I turned to ask my partner why he had shaken me, only to find him sound asleep on the other side of the bed. Driven by a sudden impulse, I dashed to my child's room and switched on the light, prompting a sharp gasp from the crib, a sound often made by infants when respiration resumes suddenly after pausing. These unsettling experiences, along with the peculiar behaviors of our pets and the toys' unexplained activations, persisted until my child no longer required supplemental oxygen and caffeine. After that, the strange occurrences ceased, the pets calmed, and the toy stopped activating by itself. Reflecting on these events, I believe that a guardian spirit, perhaps a young indigenous woman in her 20s, had followed us from the hospital to watch over my child. Her presence in my dreams and the life-saving intervention that night left me eternally grateful for her ethereal protection over my family. During a peak season rush at a 5-star resort where I worked as a receptionist, I encountered an unforgettable and chilling event. We were extremely busy, with guests arriving in waves, and among them was a family of 5 I was preparing to check in next. This family, as I initially saw them, consisted of a couple, 2 children, and an elderly woman, who I assumed was a grandparent. As per the resort's safety policy, which required details of all staying guests, I asked the family for their information. The father provided the names but listed only 4, not accounting for the elderly woman. In the chaos of peak season, I couldn't immediately address the discrepancy as they moved toward the concierge. Once the rush slowed down, I called their room to request the missing details. To my surprise, the father, appearing confused, returned to the reception and assured me that only 4 of them, the couple and their 2 children, were staying. Perplexed, I described the elderly woman I had seen, detailing her attire and appearance. Reacting with shock, the man showed me a photo on his phone of the same woman, dressed identically, but this time lying in a coffin. He explained she was his mother, who had passed away months earlier. Stunned and embarrassed, I apologized for the mix-up. We agreed to dismiss the eerie incident, and upon their departure, there was no sign of the mysterious 5th guest. This experience, hauntingly vivid, still sends shivers down my spine whenever I recall the sight of the elderly woman who wasn't supposed to be there. My boyfriend and I have been together for 9 years now, and early on in our relationship, I had an experience that has stayed with me. I've always suffered from night terrors, but that's not something you bring up on a first date. This happened back when we had been dating for only a few months and had just started spending the night together. One night, we were sleeping at his place. I woke up in the middle of the night and noticed that we were holding hands. I thought it was cute, but then I noticed something strange. His hand felt pale and thin. My boyfriend has large, rough hands, almost like an orc's, so this was immediately odd. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw that both of his hands were crossed on his stomach, yet I was still holding onto a third, pale hand. As I became aware of this, I saw a figure resembling a woman with long black hair hanging over her face. She sat up from behind my boyfriend, looked at me, and then laid back down. For some reason, I found myself stroking the pale hand with my thumb, as you might when holding hands with someone. It seemed like a strange thing to do, but at the time, I wrote it off as dream logic. Since we were still early in our relationship, I didn't tell him about it. I didn't want him to think I was crazy. Years went by, and we eventually moved in together. By then, he was well aware of my paranormal beliefs and my history with night terrors. One day, out of the blue, I remembered that strange night and decided to share it with him. Did I ever tell you about that night terror I had at your place when we first got together? I asked, laughing a little. I saw someone who looked like Sadako from The Ring in your bed. I almost got jealous. I joked. But instead of laughing, my boyfriend turned pale. Did she try to hold your hand? He asked. I was taken aback by his reaction. I told him that I did hold her hand and even remembered stroking it with my thumb. That's when he revealed something that shook me. As a child, he used to have a recurring nightmare about a woman with long black hair and pale hands trying to hold his hands. He would always wake up in a panic before she ever got to him. He had never told me about it because he had always dismissed it as just a childhood nightmare. Now, neither of us thinks it was just a nightmare. In the days that followed, we talked more about this mysterious woman. My boyfriend shared more details about his experiences, and I realized that this was more than just a strange dream. In his childhood nightmare, he would find himself in a warm, colorful room with his grandparents. Everything seemed normal until he left the room. The moment he stepped out, the warmth and colors disappeared, leaving everything cold and empty. When he tried to go back into the room, his grandparents were gone, and the room was just an empty, lifeless space. As he opened the door to leave again, the woman with the long black hair would appear, rushing towards him. He always managed to shut the door just in time, but the fear stayed with him. Eventually, the warmth and color would return, and he would wake up. Years later, while sleeping at my place, he had another encounter with her. My boyfriend is not prone to night terrors, but one night, he suddenly bolted upright, yelling, "She's here." She was so close to me. Naturally, this scared me out of my wits. When I asked him what had happened, he told me that he had suddenly felt cold, as if all the warmth had been sucked out of the room. He then felt someone grab his arm, and when he pulled the covers up to shield himself, he saw her face hovering inches from his. I remember thinking, she followed us. She's here now. From my boyfriend's account, I realized that this woman wasn't as protective or motherly as I had initially thought. Whatever she was, she seemed more ominous and unsettling. Thankfully, she hasn't made an appearance since 2017, and we hope she has found peace. But if she hasn't, I suppose we'll be the first to know. When I was 6 years old, I had an experience that still leaves me questioning what really happened. It all started when I developed appendicitis. Despite numerous visits to the doctor, he kept insisting it was just a bad stomach ache. He even told my mother that if I had appendicitis, I wouldn't be able to do the things I was doing, like playing with toys. As it turned out, my appendix was in an unusual position, which is why it wasn't diagnosed sooner. One day, while I was at my babysitter's house, my appendix burst. I vividly remember the intense pain, the vomiting, and eventually fainting into a pool of my own vomit. I was later told that an ambulance was called, and I was rushed to the hospital. During that time, I started to notice an older man whom I had never seen before, and it seemed like I was the only one who could see him. I remember every detail about him. He had a big, unruly beard that was salt and pepper, slick-back dark hair, and dark eyes. He wore a plain black Henley t-shirt, a faded leather jacket, tight jeans, and beat-up Converse high tops. The look in his eyes was one of melancholy and understanding, what I could only describe as a sad look, like how adults look when they see a kid in pain. I saw him several times, in the ambulance, in the hospital, likely when I was in the ICU, and a few more times in my room after surgery. He didn't speak much, but I remember him shaking his head and chuckling to himself a few times. The last time I saw him, I woke up in the middle of the night. He was standing by my bed, staring at my mom, who was asleep in the chair next to me. When I looked at him, he turned to me and finally spoke, "This sucks, I know. Sorry, kid." After that, I never saw him again, but his image stayed with me. Not long after, I discovered the book and movie The Outsiders and became obsessed with the greaser style, the same style this man had. I wrote stories, essays, and became fascinated with that era, though as I grew older, my interest faded. But I never forgot the man. Fast forward to a couple of years ago, on Halloween. I decided to dress up as a greaser using some random clothes I had. This was over 20 years later. I hadn't shaved in a while because of a bet to grow out my beard, so I did my best to create the look of a greaser and asked my wife, we were dating then, if I pulled it off. She said I looked like a combination of a biker and a greaser because of the beard, but the leather jacket and slicked back hair were spot on. I went to a full-length mirror to check out my costume, and there I was, looking like a slightly younger version of the man I saw when I was 6. The only major difference? My beard wasn't salt and pepper yet. I was in complete shock. My wife noticed and asked what was wrong, saying I looked like I'd seen a ghost. Go figure. As time has passed since that Halloween, I've stopped wearing leather jackets and don't wear Converse much anymore. I even pluck out the white hairs in my beard because if I don't, I start looking more and more like that man. I have no idea what that experience was or why it happened, but it's something that stuck with me. My wife tells me not to worry, saying everyone goes gray eventually. I hadn't told her about the man because, honestly, it sounds crazy. After seeing the support and comments from others who have had similar experiences, I decided to open up to my wife about what happened. I spent 4 hours explaining everything to her in as much detail as I could remember. She was confused at first, asking if I was sure no one else saw the man or if it could have been a random bystander during my pain. But as I explained more, she became intrigued. Now, she's more curious than ever. She's been diving into all sorts of theories, whether the man was real but somehow ignored by others, a spirit protector, someone from an alternate universe, or even an alien or higher being who knew what I would look like in the future to bring me comfort. It's her new obsession. She even asked me to sketch the man's face, and once I'm done, she wants me to share it to see what others think. I'm not sure what I was so scared of when it came to telling her my story, but now she's fascinated by it. It's become her newest hobby, and she wants to talk about it all the time. We're both on a journey to find answers, but for now, I'll keep wondering who that man really was and why he appeared to me during such a critical time in my life. A while back, I was looking through a photo album with my mom when we came across some pictures of my aunt's farm. Even though I was only 4 at the time, I have a vivid memory of that place, especially of a little girl I used to play with there. It was strange because it was my first time meeting my aunt, uncle, and cousin. They were all together, arms around each other, except for this little girl. She had long curly blonde hair, fair skin, blue eyes, and wore a blue overall dress with a white shirt underneath. She was standing off to the side, ignored by everyone else, yet she was looking at me with a charming smile. I remember feeling confused, wondering if she had done something bad to be ignored like that. Later on, while we were having dinner, I saw her again at the stairwell, beckoning me to come play with her. I asked my mom if I could go play, and she said yes. Everyone was so absorbed in their conversation that they didn't notice me heading up the stairs with the girl. She led me to my aunt's bedroom and into a closet, away from all the noise. The closet door was left slightly open, letting in just enough light from the hallway to illuminate her face. She handed me some cards, and since I had no idea what to do with them, she tried to teach me. We played for a while until my mom started calling out my name, looking for me. Just as my mom entered the room, the little girl began to fade into the shadows, leaving me alone in the closet with a handful of cards. When I saw those pictures in the photo album, I asked my mom what had happened to that house. She told me that my aunt had sold it. When I asked why, she said it was actually because I had freaked everyone out. Intrigued, I pressed her for more details. She explained that when they noticed I was missing, they searched for me and eventually found me in my aunt's room, in the closet, playing with some cards. No one knew where I had gotten the cards from, and they were especially weirded out when I kept asking about the girl, whose name I couldn't recall. I ended up telling my mom about my experience with the girl. She was interested but also visibly unnerved, so we eventually changed the subject. It's so strange having that memory. As a kid, I honestly thought I had another cousin and that my aunt and uncle were hiding her from me. It wasn't until my aunt later gave birth to a little girl that I moved on from trying to see that mysterious girl again. Several years ago, I worked in a casino. One night, an elderly woman approached me, asking about how to page someone over the intercom. I tried to explain where she could go, but she insisted that I personally walk her to the desk. As we walked through the casino, she started talking to me about how she was a medium, and how her family had always advised her against sharing that information. Working in a casino, you meet all sorts of people, some of them scammers or just plain odd. So, while I was polite, I didn't engage much in the conversation. Then, she mentioned something about my sister. I stopped, puzzled, and asked how she knew my sister. She didn't, but she began to talk at length about my family. At that time, my sister was going through a difficult period that was affecting us all. I was curious but still skeptical, so I listened without giving anything away. She went into great detail about my father, mother, and how I fit into the situation. She even became visibly emotional, as if she could feel what my mother was feeling. She told me that, being the oldest and the most diplomatic in my family, I needed to be more outspoken with everyone involved. Everything she said was eerily accurate and insightful. But then she shifted focus, talking about someone I worked with. She described this person in great detail, including how they felt about me, and even advised me to be cautious. At that point, she lost me. I couldn't think of anyone at work who fit that description, so I became skeptical again and reminded her that I needed to get back to work. As we continued walking, I found myself astonished once more, not just by what she was saying, but by how she said it. Her body language, expressions, and emotional energy were captivating. As we got closer to our destination, she abruptly stopped. I stopped too and turned to face her. Before I could say anything, she placed her palm at the base of my sternum, just above my belly button. Immediately, I felt a strange physical sensation. I was paralyzed, almost as if she was draining the breath from my body. Everything around me, the lights, the sounds of the games, the people, seemed to move in slow motion, as if I was leaving my body. It could have been just a few seconds, or it could have been 20 minutes, I couldn't tell. My knees felt weak, and I was on the verge of passing out. Security noticed something was off and approached us. When they interrupted, it startled her, and I felt a shockwave through my body. She quickly pulled her hand away and started apologizing. As soon as she did, I could breathe again and felt control returning to my body. I was completely freaked out, and it must have shown because security kept asking if I was okay. I assured them I was fine, and they walked away. The woman was still apologizing and then said, "If you don't do something about that ulcer, it's going to kill you." I was so unnerved that I thanked her quickly and returned to my office. Not only was I mentally shaken, but I also felt completely drained of physical energy. That encounter has stuck with me as one of the most profound experiences of my life. At the time, I had been dealing with stomach issues and had suspected I might have an ulcer, a side effect of the medication I was taking. But I was too scared to get it checked out. If that wasn't strange enough, it gets even weirder. This happened nearly 10 years ago, and the second part of what she said, the part about the coworker that initially made no sense, recently clicked. A few years ago, the situation she described unfolded in my life, down to the very specific details she had mentioned. The person she described, whom I hadn't even met yet, fit her description perfectly. The eerie part is that the situation occurred almost exactly 7 years after she described it to me, and it involved a person I hadn't even known at the time, in a different state and company. I'm still trying to make sense of it all. I've always been open to this kind of stuff but approached it with skepticism. I'm sharing this here to see what others might think. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this bizarre experience. A couple of weeks ago, during a virtual meeting with my friends and family back in Peru, my uncle, a retired Peruvian army member, decided it was time to share a story he had kept secret for decades. He wanted to clear his conscience, fearing that if COVID-19 took him, he wouldn't rest in peace. Back in the late 1980s, he commanded a group of 18 soldiers fighting terrorism in the Peruvian Amazon. One day, they were tasked with walking to a small town in the region called Pucallpa. Heavily armed, they began their journey late in the evening, prepared to repel any attacks from the terrorist groups and drug cartels that controlled the area. The night was clear, and the full moon lit their path. As they walked through the jungle, my uncle asked for a team count. To his confusion, they counted 19 soldiers each time, even though there were only supposed to be 18. Unable to understand how this was possible, he called his men to gather for a face-to-face count. He was petrified when they realized there was an additional person among them, identical to a member of his team, same face, same body, same clothes, and even the same weapons. My uncle couldn't believe what he was seeing. In the military, every soldier has a secret word to identify themselves, so they asked this figure for the word. But it didn't respond. Realizing something was very wrong, they opened fire, but when they searched the bushes behind where it had been standing, they found nothing. After making sure the group was complete, they continued their march. But after some time, my uncle asked for another count, and once again, there were 19 members in the group of 18. This time, the figure had copied someone else in the team. My uncle said this kept happening repeatedly for about 7 kilometers of their 12-kilometer journey. He believes that most of his men were copied at some point during the march. The experience left them all in disbelief, but they became even more terrified when they realized there wasn't just a moon above their heads during the entire ordeal. A large, rock-like object had been following them until they reached the next town's boundaries, where it flew away and disappeared. My uncle and his team agreed never to speak of this experience outside their group. At that time, such a story could have ended their military careers. In response to questions raised by others after I first shared this story, I had another conversation with my uncle to gather more details. He explained that during those years, the region was essentially a war zone due to the presence of Sendero Luminoso, Shining Path, a notorious terrorist group in Peru. Because of this, his team was always heavily armed and camouflaged, constantly on high alert. When the strange events occurred, their first thought wasn't that it was something paranormal, they believed it was an enemy trying to infiltrate their group. When asked why they didn't try to capture this mysterious figure for interrogation, my uncle explained that it's easy to suggest such actions now, years after the fact, but in the heat of the moment, survival was their priority. He also revealed that the last person the figure copied was himself. When he realized this, he decided to surround and confront the being. He tried using all kinds of words to get a response, but there was none. To escalate the situation, he pointed his gun at the figure. He was terrified, as were all his men, when the creature smiled at them. Despite my uncle's threats, the being started to walk away. They all fired their guns, but the figure vanished into the jungle. Eventually, my uncle had to report the incident, and his commanders were skeptical of his story. However, his team members submitted reports that matched his exactly. Although they had to account for the several rounds of missing ammunition, everything was cleared when satellite readings confirmed the gunfire and timing, although they couldn't capture what the soldiers were shooting at. After some research, we found a local folklore belief that might explain the events my uncle and his team experienced. It's known as El Cholachaqui, a mythical figure in Peruvian folklore believed to deceive people by taking on their appearance. While this could provide some explanation, who knows what truly happened in those dense, mysterious jungles. Last night, I had a long conversation with my dad about the house I grew up in. I lived there from the age of 6 until I was 15, and now, at 21, I've just learned some unsettling details about its history. Apparently, the previous owner of the house was a recluse who suffered from mental illness. He tragically ended his life with a shotgun in what later became my bedroom, right next to the window. There's a bleached spot on the hardwood floor there that I always covered up with a chair, never knowing what had happened in that exact spot. My dad didn't know about the house's history until after we had already moved in. One day, while he was doing yard work, a police officer approached him and said something like, "Don't let the history of this place scare you, it's a beautiful property." My dad was puzzled and asked what the officer meant, and that's when he learned about the former owner's suicide. Naturally, I'm pretty creeped out by this revelation. I don't remember ever feeling unsafe in that house, but strange things did happen. The lock on my bedroom door would mysteriously lock itself during our first year living there. I vividly remember one time when my friend and I got locked inside my room, and firefighters had to come and pull us out through the window. After that incident, my dad just removed the doorknob entirely, so I grew up without a doorknob on my door. There were also crosses above my sister's and my bedroom doors, which I never questioned. It turns out that my dad had a priest come over to bless the doorways, likely because of the house's dark past. This whole situation affected my dad more than I realized. One day, he was working on the roof, using a ladder right outside my bedroom window. He was in control when, out of nowhere, the ladder folded and slipped sideways, causing him to fall 10 feet. He almost died. Later, when my parents got divorced, my mom took my sister and me to live somewhere else, and my dad stayed in the house alone for about 2 years. He said that things got so disturbing that he finally had to move out. He would often come home from work at night through the basement, and the air would be thick with the smell of smoke. The scent was so strong that he thought someone had broken in. But then, when he went upstairs and came back down to check, the smell would be gone, just like that. Learning all this has really shaken me. I can't stop thinking about the fact that I lived in a room where such a tragic event took place, especially since I had my own suicide attempt in that same room. It's a lot to process, and I'm struggling with the idea that I shared space with such a heavy past. I just hope that the man who lived there before is finally at peace. Does anyone have positive stories about spirits moving on after something like this? I'm trying to make sense of it all and could use some reassurance. Last December, I escaped an abusive relationship and moved in with my friend, Sarah. She lives in a small upper-level duplex, and I stayed with her for a while along with my cat and dog. It was a bit crowded, especially since Sarah also had a dog. Next door to Sarah's duplex was an old 4-bedroom house owned by her friend, Jake. who lives abroad. The couple renting Jake's place had just bought a house and suggested I stay there temporarily while I searched for an apartment. I was thrilled at the idea. Sarah's dog and mine could play together, and we could still hang out all the time. Jake agreed to let me stay there, asking for only a small amount of rent, mainly so I could house sit until he returned in May. It was a great opportunity, as finding a place in May would be much easier due to the warmer weather. Before I moved in, Sarah warned me that the house had some quirks, including a creepy basement. She said that if I ever felt uncomfortable, I was welcome to come back to her place anytime. Sarah had lived in that house for a couple of years, so I trusted her judgment. The first time one of the tenants showed me around the house, I felt something was off. I attributed it to the strange layout, the draftiness, and the lack of sunlight in the back of the house. The upstairs had 2 bedrooms with a bathroom in the middle. The front bedroom was warm and sunny, but the rest of the upstairs was noticeably colder. When I entered the back bedroom, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The energy in that room felt so unsettling that I quickly closed the door and left. The first few weeks were uneventful, but I never felt entirely at ease. It always seemed like I was being watched. I dismissed it as nerves from living alone for the first time, but I started having trouble sleeping. The only place in the house where I felt comfortable was my bedroom, the front bedroom upstairs. One night, I decided to relax and watch a movie in the living room after smoking some weed. I fell asleep on the couch and woke up to what sounded like someone running up the stairs and slamming the door to the back bedroom. My dog looked startled and ran upstairs, growling at the closed door. When I checked, there was no one there. After that, I decided to lay off the weed, but I still heard footsteps pacing in the back room on some nights. Strange things continued to happen. While taking a bath in the upstairs bathroom, my dog would lay in the doorway and stare at the back room, sometimes growling or barking at it. I would come home to find the door open, even though I was sure I had closed it. My cat also seemed fixated on the room, meowing to be let in. On a few occasions, I found my cat shut inside the room. During this time, my bath towel went missing, and I couldn't find it anywhere. These experiences began to take a toll on me. I had nightmares every night and often woke up to my dog whining between 3 to 4 a.m. The constant feeling of being watched and the heavy atmosphere of the house became overwhelming. I finally confided in Sarah about what was happening, and she admitted that she had experienced strange things when she lived there too. Her bedroom had been the back room, and she once woke up in a semi-dream state to see a man standing at the end of her bed. She had even talked to him, only to wake up for real and find texts from her roommate asking who she was talking to. She also mentioned seeing things move out of the corner of her eye, hearing footsteps, and feeling like she was being watched. One time, she saw footsteps in the snow leading from the back door to the middle of the lawn, then disappearing. One day, after hearing footsteps in the living room, I felt so overwhelmed that I started crying. Desperate, I decided to try talking to the presence. I said, "Hey, I know this is your house too. I'm leaving in a month. I've been through so much pain these past few months. Please just leave me alone. Please let me know you've heard me." Immediately after, the door upstairs slammed shut. After that, the nightmares stopped, and I began to sleep through the night. The presence seemed to lessen. One night, I was in Sarah's backyard with our dogs and her downstairs neighbor, Mike, celebrating the fact that I had finally found an apartment. I went back to the house to grab more beers and a sweater. As I was running up the stairs, I saw an opaque, black silhouette standing at the top. I couldn't make out any features, but it was as real as a person standing there. I screamed and ran back down, turning on the stairway light. When I looked again, no one was there, but the back room door was open. The day of my move finally arrived, and I felt immense relief in my new apartment, where I sensed nothing unusual. I returned to the house one last time to check if I had forgotten anything, and there, in the middle of the back room floor, was my missing bath towel, still slightly damp as if it had just been used. Funny prank, ghost. I haven't been back since. I used to work as a guide and event manager at the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, a place with a horrific history that deeply affected me. This former mental institution in Weston, West Virginia, operated from 1864 to 1994 and is now a site for historical tours and paranormal investigations. One quiet evening during my training, I experienced something unforgettable. While most of the team was upstairs, I stayed on the first floor with a couple of coworkers. As we waited in the dimly lit hallway, a perfect silhouette of a man walked across the beam of light casting from the outside. Startled, I immediately checked outside, only to find no one there, realizing too late that the window was about 7 feet off the ground. During my time there, we often used a spirit box to communicate with whatever spirits linger. In a room known for a brutal 1987 murder, I once heard a distinct voice through the static say, "Evil," right after my coworker asked if anyone outside our room was nice. The eerie timing of the response left us rushing out in fear. The paranormal activities were not just auditory but also physical. One night, while closing the ward's doors, a doorknob twisted and pulled shut in my hand without any force from me. Another night, thermal imaging captured a figure peeking out from a doorway just as a team member passed by, a sight so startling that it confirmed the presence of something unexplainable. One of the most personal and disturbing encounters happened over 2 consecutive nights in June 2017. The first night, after hearing mysterious noises and voices, I felt a painful burning on my lower back. A visible mark appeared there, lasting for nearly a week, leaving a lasting sensation that flares up to this day. The following night, while handling equipment, 3 welts formed on my arm right before my eyes, disappearing within minutes, a shocking sight that had no rational explanation. These experiences, among many others, convinced me of the reality of paranormal phenomena, a realization that eventually led to my departure from the job. The constant exposure to such intense events took a spiritual and emotional toll, akin to escaping a toxic relationship. Though I've since moved on from the asylum, the memories of those chilling encounters remain vivid, a testament to the unexplained mysteries that continue to haunt the old walls of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. I work closely with just one other person most days, and today we arrived at work early, knowing we needed to get things done before the snow started. I work at a place that makes burial vaults, and we also deliver and set them up at graveyards if the customer wants that. This morning, I went to the back of the shop to turn on the lights in each section. When I reached the last switch, I flicked it on and saw an older man leaning against the back wall, facing away from me. It startled me, so I quickly turned around to tell my coworker that someone was in the shop. He kind of laughed when I told him and said, "Oh, so you saw him, did you?" Turns out, it's the owner's father who passed away 10 years ago but still has strong ties to the place. There have been 3 other sightings of him, and mine was the 4th. I'm quite new here, so this really took me by surprise. I felt like I was dreaming. I had to sit in the bathroom for 10 minutes just to calm down. I really saw someone back there, and then he disappeared. I've always been skeptical about ghosts and spirits, but this experience has completely changed my perspective. I see life differently now. I can't stop thinking about him, though. Those blue overalls, white hair, and the cap he wore, so clear, right there, and it was a ghost. Hearing my coworker say he saw him too has made me a believer because now I know I'm not losing my mind.